What's up everyone, a quick little video here talking about augment changes and the ones that came this week and whether those augments are worth slotting into builds. Now, these are only the ones, as D has said, that can actually be easily changed, so utterly useless ones like Valkyr's Ripline are going to have to wait for another day. So let's start with a change that came to 5 different augments at once, and that is the ones for Ember, Frost, Oberon, Sarin and Volt, that allow their first ability to buff allies with a specific element, Toxin for Sarin for example. The change is that now, if you hold the ability to cast, you send it away from your position, and any ally that you touch will be buffed. Not a huge change there. The biggest change, however, is the fact that you can now buff yourself, which frankly is an amazing change, and honestly, these mods are going to be making their way into a lot of my builds for these frames. I never really used them personally because they were only usable on teammates and required you to aim specifically at your ally, so it was just so awkward to use. Now, however, definitely worth taking another look at. Staying on the topic of Sarin though, Contagion Cloud gets a buff as well. Instead of just final blows triggering the cloud, damage over time effects that kill the target will also count now as well. That includes miasma, but not spores. Spores do not count as damage over time. It got a buff to range and damage as well. For me though, Sarin is already one hell of a killer with her normal abilities, and losing a mod slot that could be better used for more tank or more range or something like that just isn't worth it to put this mod on her. If spores triggered it, and if the cloud popped the spores, then I might use it in addition to as an addition to a spore build, but sadly none of those happen, so for me, it's just not worth the mod slot. Volt's shield augment also got some changes, allows for allies to pick up your shield, and then the damage blocked will get fed into Volt's passive build up for his casting. The changes were that allies no longer cause an additional drain on Volt's energy for them holding the shield, which is nice, as well as the damage absorbed feeding into Volt's passive got a bit of a buff as well, like the damage converted. As for the mod itself, is it worth putting on a build? Well, honestly, I can't say that it is. Anytime I've used a Volt shield, literally nobody has ever even tried to pick it up, and for the most part, I have not really seen a Volt use a shield apart from maybe Eidolon runs. I don't think this mod has enough of an incentive for people to pick up the shield still, and as such, the whole mod gets wasted by the fact nobody uses it. Still, it's just sadly not worth the slot. Hysterical Assault for Valkyr got some invulnerability added to when you aim down the sights, and when I say some, I mean half a second, and a bit of increased range on the leap. The mod basically allows you to leap to an enemy while you're aiming. Now I think this change came because of the aim down sight changes, switches you from your melee and the invulnerability that comes from your 4 to your gun. And as such, people ended up getting downed in the middle of enemies as a result, especially if you do it by accident, which is very easy to do. Does this change make the mod worth using? No, not at all. Half a second is literally nothing, and it does nothing to fix the problem. Not to mention the whole switching to gun to leap actually feels like, for me, it destroyed the mod. There's a lot of times where I feel like quick switching to your gun makes melee very, very awkward, and is actually more of a downside than it is a help, and honestly, this is one of them. Rising Storm for Ash got an interesting buff actually. Attacks by the clones raise the melee combo counter and will give you a passive 10-second combo timer too. And well, yeah, this might actually have made the mod good now. You can see in the footage that against these heavy units, I stack a 4 times combo multiplier in about a minute. I need to do some more testing, however. I do feel like there might be a use for this mod, and I'm going to be playing around in the next couple of days to see if I can figure out an interesting build. Might be a legit build here. So yeah, this change might have brought some life into this mod and into Ash. One massive downside that you can see though is a target with an Ash clone on top of it is completely invulnerable to melee, which quite frankly is a major pain in the arse and really hurts it quite a bit. But in general, the mod is very, very good. Staying on Ash, Smoke Shadow got a range buff. The mod cloaks your allies within a 15 meter range now, which can be affected by range mods. Honestly, the range is still too small for a fast-paced game like Warframe, and since there's no real room to mod for strength, duration, and range, as well as tank on Ash, there's just no room for it. Sadly, this mod is still just not worth the slot. Titanic Rambler for Atlas has always been an interesting one, trading your small rumblers for one large one. Big Rumbler gets a damage buff that doesn't really do much. Extra health is nice, and extra speed, which is also pretty nice. But now, also, if you recast the ability, the Big Rumbler does an AoE knockdown and taunts everything around him into shooting him. So, worth the slot? Honestly, no. The extra damage for me just isn't that great. It falls off very, very, very quickly. And the extra taunt and knockdown from recasting your 4 is only available once per ability cast. So for me, having the 2 smaller ones actually works out better as taunts to have aggro off you, because they cover a larger area and affect more enemies. If the taunt and knockdown were recastable, maybe with a delay of a couple of seconds, so you don't just spam the crap out of it, then it might be worth messing around with. But that one-time deal is just a deal breaker for me. Oberon's Hallowed Ground Augment allows him to recast the ability, exploding it, dealing its remaining damage as pure radiation. The buff that it got now has a 100% chance to proc radiation, as well as giving a passive 100% duration to the ability. For me, honestly, the mod itself, I've never really enjoyed it. I feel it's rather pants. The damage from Hallowed Ground isn't that great, so recasting for a burst damage doesn't scale very well at all. It can be used on low to mid-level defenses as a bit of a nuke. However, moving past that, it falls off pretty quickly. However, it might get in some use in builds to replace some duration mods on builds that revolve around using Hallowed Ground. I'm not a fan of the mod, but I do think that that passive duration might have some niche uses. So this mod might find its way into some people's builds. Next is Furious Javelin for Excalibur's Radial Javelin. What this one does is basically enemies that are hit by Radial Javelin give Excel a melee damage buff. The buff that it got this week basically increased the damage buff that it gets and also the duration of the mod. This mod only has one problem for me. Chromatic Blade exists. I'll be straight up and honest, this is not a bad mod. The extra damage applies to your Exalted Blade, so it works to buff that up rather nicely. But mod slots are at a premium right now, and genuinely, Chromatic Blade is just so much better in the slot than this. It's a shame, because using Radial Javelin to buff your Exalted Blade would be a nice way to tie in Excal's kit a bit better. But it's just outclassed by the other mod, so it just ends up losing its slot because of that. It's definitely not a bad mod if you don't have Chromatic Blade though. Tidal Impunity, that's the iDroid's one for Tidal Surge, which removes status procs on you and your allies that you hit, plus leaves behind a buff that makes you and your allies immune to status for a certain amount of time. Ignoring the fact that Tidal Surge is awkward to actually use, and the fact that your allies are rarely near enough for you to hit them with it, it's not a terrible mod. Cleansing you and your allies as status procs, giving immunity to status procs for a certain time is actually really nice. It's just a shame for me that it's tied to Hydroid, and especially that ability. I really wish it was for something else, but as it is, I can't really recommend putting it onto a build. Magnetized Discharge from Mag is actually a really fun one. Basically, any enemy that gets hit with the explosion of Magnetize has a chance to be disarmed. The buff that it got is it has a passive buff to the range of Magnetize, which when modded can be actually pretty huge, and stripping enemy of their guns is always something that's going to help a lot. I quite like this mod, and I think it's worth exploring a build with it on, since reducing incoming range damage is something that is always worthwhile. It's definitely one I'm going to be playing around with a lot more in the coming days. Ace's Muzzle Flash got an update to try and make it less annoying for everybody. Basically, now for every 6 kills you get as Mesa, she will do an AoE blind on the next shot that blinds everyone on the target that she hits over a 15-meter radius. Honestly, I didn't think I was going to like it that much, but I actually like it a bit. Not only does it proc if you're using normal weapons, but it will also proc if you're using Peacemaker too, which means on the 6th kill, the group that you're unloading into with your Peacemaker will all get blinded. It ends up being a real nice little bit of crowd control added into her build. I can definitely see me playing around with this one a fair amount. Mirage got a couple of changes to her augments too. Explosive Leisure Domain got a damage buff and guaranteed status when the trap is triggered. However, it still has the massive fundamental flaw of using your own ammo and health and energy orbs as traps. It does also use lockers and consoles as well, but it also uses your ammo, health and energy orbs. So I hope you're not needing energy or ammo anytime soon, because you just turn them all into traps that do barely any damage. Personally, the mod is still awful. It's 100% not worth building for. Unlike the other one that got a buff, which is Total Eclipse, allows Mirage's damage buff to be transferred to another player. Got changed this week so the range of that is much higher, which is a super nice quality of life buff, and as always, this mod is still 100% worth that mod slot on any buff Mirage build. Talking of buff frames, Rhino's Piercing Roar got a buff too. Enemies hit by the roar got puncture proc applied to them, which is really meh since puncture procs are actually pretty terrible. But enemies are also knocked down as well. The knockdown is nice, although certain animation states like the heavy gunner's slam also stop the knockdown working. That is really annoying. But the main thing about this augment is it makes it recastable. That alone means it has a spot on my buff Rhino build. It only needs to be unranked for that as well, which saves on mod space too. It might be worth having two versions of this mod, one unranked for your buff Rhino build and one ranked if you actually want to use it for knockdown. But sadly, the original idea of the mod, that puncture proc, remains largely terrible. It's a mod though that does have its uses after these changes. Unlike target fixation for Zephyr's Tailwind, this augment boosts your next Tailwind ground slam based on how many enemies you hit with your Tailwind. Also gives you 2 seconds on the ground to get airborne again and get that damage buff active. Tailwind, as an ability, it's clunky, it's awkward, and only really works in open world spaces, and does no damage at all with the augment. For all the time you spend building up this to kill stuff, quite frankly, you may as well have just shot the enemy in the first place. 100% not worth the augment slot, or any slot, none at all. Final one here is Piercing Navigator that gives crit chance to your shot based on the distance it flies. The buff this week gave it 3 meters of punch through. It's a nice bit of quality of life to the augment, which honestly gets barely any use because Navigator also gets barely any use. The ability is pretty awkward, it's slow in a game as fast moving as Warframe. It's not something that gives enough of a bonus of this ability to make it worth using. It's not even the augment's fault. The base ability for me is just so bad that it just means it's going to be hard for an augment to change that enough to make it worthwhile. And so that's that. Quick look at all the augments that got changed this week, a real mixed bag. Some changes that don't make the augments good whatsoever, and some that makes the augments interesting and worth exploring new builds for. It's going to be interesting to see what happens from here on with the other augments that need buffing, whether they take longer because a load of them need a ground up rebuild. But for now, I'm going to go and test a whole bunch of these, see what I can do with them. Thank you all so much for watching. Please leave your thoughts on the augments in the comments below. Plus, if you think I missed a trick with some of them, let me know and I'll take a look. But for now, many thanks for watching, and I shall catch you in the next one.